This year's most thought-provoking brain discoveries. Neural circuits that label experiences as good or bad and the emotional meaninglessness of facial expressions are some standouts among 2022's mind and brain breakthroughs. Can the human brain ever really understand itself? The problem of gaining a deep knowledge of the subjective depths of the conscious mind is such a hard problem that it has in fact been named the hard problem. The human brain is impressively powerful. Its 100 billion neurons are connected by 100 trillion wire-like fibers, all squeezed into 3 pounds of squishy flesh lodged below a helmet of skull. Yet we still don't know whether this organ will ever be able to muster the requisite smarts to hack the physical processes that underlie the ineffable quality of deep blue or the sensation of middle C, as philosopher David Chalmers put it when giving examples of the hard problem of consciousness, a term he invented, in a 1995 paper. This past year did not uncover a solution to the hard problem, and one may not be forthcoming for decades, if ever. But 2022 did witness plenty of surprises and solutions to understanding the brain that do not require a complete explanation of consciousness. Such incrementalism could be seen in mid-November, when a crowd of more than 24,000 attendees of the annual Society for Neuroscience meeting gathered in San Diego, California. The event was a tribute of sorts to reductionism, the breaking down of hard problems into simpler knowable entities. At the event, there were reports of an animal study of a brain circuit that encodes social trauma and a brain-computer interface that lets a severely paralyzed person mentally spell out letters to form words. Brain discoveries abounded in 2022 and will certainly continue in 2023. Here's a look at a few prime pickings from what we published at Scientific American this year. Your brain has a thumbs up, thumbs down switch. When neuroscientist Katie was pursuing her PhD, she was told a chapter on emotion was inappropriate for her thesis. Emotion just wasn't accepted as an integral, intrinsic part of behavioral neuroscience, her field of study. That didn't make any sense to Ty. She decided to go her own way to become a leading researcher on feelings. This year Ty co-authored a Nature paper that reported on a kind of molecular switch in rodents that flags an experience as either good or bad. If human brains operate the same way as the brains of the mice in her lab, a malfunctioning thumbs up, thumbs down switch might explain some cases of depression, anxiety and addiction. Facial expressions do not convey what you've been taught about someone's emotional demeanor. Charles Darwin proposed that facial expressions are universal. A smile conveys happiness. A frown indicates sadness. He was wrong, suggests research published in recent years. Investigators found that innate expressions grounded in biology do not exist and instead are highly variable. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett warned in an essay that a recognition of Darwin's fallacy has implications for AI facial recognition systems intended to detect emotions. Your kid may be a dandelion and an orchid and even a tulip. Pigeonholing a child as either sensitive or resilient is probably a mistake. That child is not necessarily just an orchid overly sensitive to adverse experiences or a dandelion relatively immune to such events. Newly arrived in the mix are tulips, children who experience modest effects from what's happening around them. But even this floral triad might not suffice. Many kids are psychological mixes, mosaics. Studies showed this past year. They display sensitivity to some but not all influences around them, depending on a particular situation. If you see something, IT may help you to say something. In a marriage of neuroscience and pedagogy, researchers tried to assess what a curriculum that emphasized the learning of spatial skills would do for kids. One example, an assignment that involved creating a map to track bears in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Kids at 5 Virginia high schools took courses and their performance was matched against another group that received lessons without the spatial learning component. The results of the research, published in August, showed that students in the spatial learning group improved not only spatial skills but also verbal abilities, figuring out a problem using words. How the brain constructs the outside world. Neural activity probes your physical surroundings to select just the information needed to survive and flourish. As a young course instructor in seminars for medical students, I faithfully taught neurophysiology by the book, enthusiastically explaining how the brain perceives the world and controls the body. Sensory stimuli from the eyes, ears, and such are converted to electrical signals and then transmitted to the relevant parts of the sensory cortex that process these inputs and induce perception. To initiate a movement, impulses from the motor cortex instruct the spinal cord neurons to produce muscular contraction. Most students were happy with my textbook explanations of the brain's input-output mechanisms. Yet a minority, the clever ones, always asked a series of awkward questions. Where in the brain does perception occur? What initiates a finger movement before cells in the motor cortex fire? I would always dispatch their queries with a simple answer. That all happens in the neocortex. Then I would skillfully change the subject or use a few obscure Latin terms that my students did not really understand but that seemed scientific enough so that my authoritative-sounding accounts temporarily satisfied them. Like other young researchers, I began my investigation of the brain without worrying much whether this perception-action theoretical framework was right or wrong. I was happy for many years with my own progress and the spectacular discoveries that gradually evolved into what became known in the 1960s as the field of neuroscience. Yet my inability to give satisfactory answers to the legitimate questions of my smartest students has haunted me ever since. I had to wrestle with the difficulty of trying to explain something that I didn't really understand. Over the years I realized that this frustration was not uniquely my own. Many of my colleagues, whether they admitted it or not, felt the same way. There was a bright side, though, because these frustrations energized my career. They nudged me over the years to develop a perspective that provides an alternative description of how the brain interacts with the outside world. The challenge for me and other neuroscientists involves the weighty question of what, exactly, is the mind. Ever since the time of Aristotle, thinkers have assumed that the soul or the mind is initially a blank slate, a tabula rasa on which experiences are painted. This view has influenced thinking in Christian and Persian philosophies, British empiricism and Marxist doctrine. In the past century it has also permeated psychology and cognitive science. This outside-in view portrays the mind as a tool for learning about the true nature of the world. The alternative view, one that has defined my research, asserts that the primary preoccupation of brain networks is to maintain their own internal dynamics and perpetually generate myriad nonsensical patterns of neural activity. When a seemingly random action offers a benefit to an organism's survival, the neuronal pattern leading to that action gains meaning. When an infant utters TT, the parent happily offers the baby teddy, so the sound TT acquires the meaning of the teddy bear. Recent progress in neuroscience has lent support to this framework. Does the brain represent the world? Neuroscience inherited the blank slate framework millennia after early thinkers gave names like tabula rasa to mental operations. Even today we still search for neural mechanisms that might relate to their dreamed-up ideas. The dominance of the outside-in framework is illustrated by the outstanding discoveries of the legendary scientific duo David Hubble and Torsten Wiesel, who introduced single neuronal recordings to study the visual system and were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1981. In their signature experiments, they recorded neural activity in animals while showing them images of various shapes. Moving lines, edges, light or dark areas, and other physical qualities elicited firing in different sets of neurons. The assumption was that neuronal computation starts with simple patterns that are synthesized into more complex ones. These features are then bound together somewhere in the brain to represent an object. No active participation is needed. The brain automatically performs this exercise. The outside-in framework presumes that the brain's fundamental function is to perceive signals from the world and correctly interpret them. But if this assumption is true, an additional operation is needed to respond to these signals. Wedged between perceptual inputs and outputs resides a hypothetical central processor which takes in sensory representations from the environment and makes decisions about what to do with them to perform the correct action. So what exactly is the central processor in this outside-in paradigm? This poorly understood and speculative entity goes by various names: free will, homunculus, decision maker, executive function, intervening variables, or simply just a black box. It all depends on the experimenter's philosophical inclination and whether the mental operation in question is applied to the human brain, brains of other animals, or computer models. Yet all these concepts refer to the same thing. An implicit practical implication of the outside-in framework is that the next frontier for progress in contemporary neuroscience should be to find where the putative central processor cannot see events that happen in the world. There is no interpreter in the brain to assign meaning to these changes in neuronal firing patterns. There is no interpreter in the brain to assign meaning to these changes in neuronal firing patterns. Cannot see events that happen in the world. There is no interpreter in the brain to assign meaning to these changes in neuronal firing patterns. Cannot see events that happen in the world. There is no interpreter in the brain to assign meaning to these changes in neuronal firing patterns.